Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider Indianapolis Starts, your Friday rundown for December 15th, 2023. A lot to talk about. I think we'll try to cover a lot in a short space of time because there's a fair bit for me going on this afternoon, including a kindergarten holiday party in a couple hours. The big thing, obviously, is Kansas this weekend, Saturday, 12:30, Indiana, Kansas at Assembly Hall. In terms of sort of the prestige of this matchup, all that kind of speaks for itself. These are two of obviously the most vested basketball programs in college basketball history. This is the second year of this series. I suspect it won't be extended just because I think both of these teams have a number of scheduling commitments already on the books in the next 2 or 3 years, including IU's renewed series with Kentucky that would get in the way of that. I do think both sides have appreciated this series. I just, I wouldn't shelve it going forward. I just don't know if they'll be able to make an extension off this current 2-year run. The matchup with Kansas. First of all, we talked to Mike Woodson this morning. Again, we're talking on Friday. He wouldn't really commit either way, but it didn't sound particularly encouraging for Xavier Johnson, who's been dealing with this lower leg injury. And, unless Woodson was just pulling the wool over everybody's eyes, normally he's willing to kind of talk about, well, he's been back at practice or he's been running or doing anything like that. And there was none of that. There was just kind of we don't know yet. We'll have to see when we can get him back. The other big question, I think, for Indiana is health-wise is going to be that list of questionables for the Auburn game. No one's confirmed it. I suspect there was an illness going through the team around then. Just based on some guys who we knew had been sick, had kind of confirmed they'd been sick in the recent days. You would like to think that's kind of burned through a roster now. But are all those guys back to 100%? And then you look at Kansas, which is a tough matchup. There are some things that I think do benefit Indiana in this matchup. Kansas doesn't shoot a ton of threes. Kansas doesn't make a ton of threes. I don't think Kansas, they're a really good defensive team. I think quietly Bill Self may be getting more out of Hunter Dickinson than anybody ever did at Michigan. But I don't think Kansas has quite the sort of disruptive length that gave Indiana so much trouble a season ago. I think that the big questions for me are Kansas is really good defending twos, and Indiana can't really win games like this without being good in the paint. Can Indiana's front court outplay Kansas's post and rim defense? I think that's the first big question I have. The second one is, can you stay out of foul trouble? Can key guys stay out of foul trouble when you're dealing with the Hunter Dickinsons and the KJ Adamses and even at times probably the Kevin McCullers, because you've got to keep guys on the floor. Third one is defensive matchups. McCullar and DeJuan Harris, who's been Kansas's point guard for a couple years now, are going to be on the floor most of the time. If you look at Ken Palm's last five games, 10 most used lineups feature, Harris is the point guard in every single one of those. McCullar is on the floor as the 2, most often the 3, every so often the 4 in every single one of those. The point is you're going to have to deal with both of those guys for a lot of the game. McCullar is shooting the ball really well, scoring the ball really well, basically as good as he pretty much ever has in his career. And Harris is one of the sort of most unflappable point guards in the country. He's a junior who's played a lot of minutes in a Kansas uniform. He gave Indiana trouble last year. And if you don't have Xavier Johnson, how do you match that up? Are you comfortable with Gabe Cupps doing big minutes on DeJuan Harris? Do you lean a little bit more heavily on a CJ Gunn in a game like this? Where do you put Trey Galloway? I think I said this on to Alex Bozich on Inside the Halls podcast earlier today. I understand people who want more out of Galloway offensively in terms of production, but I think this is a game where unless he just goes for a career high, Galloway probably walks off the floor feeling good or bad about how he played based first on his defensive performance. Do you put him on McCullar, which is probably a little bit more of a natural cover, especially when you consider Mackenzie Mbako has struggled some defensively? Do you put him on Harris and hope that maybe disrupting Kansas's point guard play takes them out of their offense a little bit? I think that Mike Woodson's going to have, a tough decision to start and then a tough evolving decision as the game wears on how he kind of matches up. And I wouldn't be shocked if we see more CJ Gunn and Caleb Banks in a game like this, because if you're Indiana, you were looking for either some straight matchups or maybe even some matchup advantages against that 1-2-3 combination with Kansas. And the last thing I would say with Kansas is, as I said, they don't shoot a lot of threes and they don't make a lot of threes. They're 320th in the country in three-point attempts as 3-point attempts as an overall percentage of field goal attempts. And they are 284th in the country in percentage of points scored off threes. So they're not quite as sort of extreme, like living at the extremes the way Indiana is offensively. But they are among the lowest ranked teams in the country in basically 3-point attempts and how many points they score off threes. I think only like 3 times this season have they hit at least 9 threes in a game. Only 3 times this season have they attempted at least 20. Again, it's not as extreme as Indiana, but they don't tend to weaponize the 3-point line that well. They had a couple good games recently. UConn, they were 9 of 14. Missouri, Kansas City, they were 8 of 20, but sandwiched around that, they were only 3 of 14 against Eastern Illinois, 4 of 12 against Tennessee, 6 of 17 in the loss in Maui to Marquette, 4 of 19 in the win over Chaminade, 3 of 10 last weekend against Missouri. You can't let Kansas get going from 3 because they do have guys that can make them. Statistically speaking, McCullough can make them. I'm looking at their KenPom profile up here. McCullough can make them. Dickinson can make them. Johnny Furphy can make them. Nicholas Timberlake has struggled shooting the ball early in the season, but he has a history of being a good shooter. He's the sort of player I think you've got to be really careful. You don't let him get comfortable and let this be the game where he finds his range. Even Harris, who is historically not a great 3-point shooter, not a terrible one, but not necessarily one that goes at a ton of volume. He did shoot 40.5% last year, but he's 8 of 18. So if you let him if you give him open ones, he'll take them and he'll make them. You can't let Kansas add something to its overall sort of like offensive profile that it doesn't normally lean on because it's already so efficient on twos. They've spread the ball around really well. One really interesting statistic that Alex Bozich on that podcast pointed out to me is 73% of their made field goals are assisted. That is the highest number in all of college basketball right now. So they share the ball well. They're really confident in the stuff they run. And when they get the chance, they finish. They do make a high percentage of their threes. They shoot more than 40% on 3. They just don't take a lot of them. And they're 22nd nationally in 2-point percentage, as well as 10th in an opponent 2-point percentage, sort of speaking back to Indiana having to win that battle in the paint. You can't let them gear up beyond the 3-point line because they're already going to present you so many challenges scoring the ball that I think you've got, if you're Kansas, or if you're Indiana, you've got to be able to sort of keep that out of the game. Don't let that become so you don't necessarily have to make more threes than Kansas, but you can't let that become a strength for Kansas. You can't let it become lopsided where Kansas hits 11 and Indiana only hits 4. That leaves you way too much of a gap offensively to make up against a team that's so good as Kansas is in other areas. So it'll be interesting. Also talked a lot on Mind Your Banners today about sort of what the Kansas win would mean in the, sort of weaved into the fabric of the season. So give that a listen. If you haven't already, on whatever, it's on my YouTube channel, or our YouTube channel, I guess I should say. It's on all the podcast platforms you would expect. So get that if it interests you. And it's just fair to say it's a very big game for Indiana. There's no, you don't need to kind of cut it up any more than that. Talking a little bit about football, we're not going to cover every base because there's just a lot going on. A couple of things I did want to touch on. Two things with football, beyond just sort of the acknowledgement that Curt Cignetti and his staff are quietly moving a lot of visitors through at a pretty impressive rate right now as they try to restock their roster. Clearly a focus on defensive line, clearly a focus on wide receiver. Start with wide receiver. There have been multiple reports that Donovan McCulley is now expected to stay with Indiana. I think it's fair to say that early on, kind of post Cignetti's hiring, there was a real just sort of wave of optimism about keeping a number of those guys that had gone to the portal, including McCulley. Then it's probably fair to say once Penn State, Michigan, Texas A&M threw in their hat, there were some rumors Notre Dame was sniffing around. I also heard Florida State might have been at least kind of, doing due diligence. I don't know why I can't talk today. I haven't. It's not come even. I had my last cup of coffee like 3 hours ago, so I'm not even that jittery. But the point is, once that caliber of program started getting involved, I think it's fair to say sort of optimism McCulley might be coming back went down. But there have been a number of reports suggesting he may well be returning. What I would say is we've heard the same thing, and it's one of those where we just kind of don't track the portal quite as closely in terms of where a guy might be leaning or what to expect. But I think it is fair to say, that the optimism was kind of rising after Curt Cignetti was hired. It certainly went down once you saw some of these more blue blood type schools kind of get involved. It has gone back up pretty significantly in, I would say, the last probably 24 hours. Again, we're talking on Friday afternoon. I would say that is probably yesterday afternoon when it started to kind of filter through that McCulley might be considering staying. If he did, it would be a big win for Indiana. I think he's going to have an outstanding season wherever he goes. He's going to be a senior next year, a fourth-year senior, so this will be his last year of college football. I think he's figured out a lot of that receiver position, and I think he's primed for a really good year. I also think and I'm going to write something on this in a little bit. I think it's symbolically important for Indiana if they can get McCulley back, and if basically Indiana can show that it's in a position with NIL, with its head coach, its resources, its program momentum, program-wide momentum, that it can go out and it can keep its best players, essentially. And that's not going to happen every time you go through this cycle. But if you can prove you can do that fairly consistently, suddenly people are going to recognize that you might have the resources you're talking about, and that's important. And you know how to kind of move them around and marshal them correctly, and that's important. And then obviously you also just get a player who I think is genuinely all Big Ten caliber, first team all Big Ten caliber, back at wide receiver. The other big name this week who has committed publicly is Curtis Rourke from I keep wanting to say Ohio State. Forgive me, from Ohio. I really don't know why I can't talk today. Rourke had about 7,600 passing yards, I think 50 touchdowns, primarily across 3 seasons. He got a few snaps as a redshirt freshman, but it's really been the last 3 years that he's been kind of the unquestioned starter, and he's been really good. He's got a good completion percentage. Obviously, he's down at the MAC level, but Ohio has put together back-to-back 9-win seasons down there. He tore his ACL at the end of the 2022 season, but he was able to get back and contribute pretty substantially in 2023. And it's also worth saying, even with the injury, he was MAC Offensive Player of the Year in 2022. So he's an obvious candidate for a step up to the next level, and now he's going to get it with Indiana. And he kind of gives Curt Cignetti and his staff, a veteran that can maybe be impactful this year. You would expect him to kind of be front of the queue to win that starting job, though, of course, he'll have to earn it. And then also be a bridge to, maybe developing some of the younger quarterbacks that you've got, like a Taven Jackson or an Alberto Mendoza, Brock Lowry, whoever, and just kind of seeing what you have in some of those younger, less proven players in your quarterback room. And it also helps to bring back a player of that caliber when you are recruiting, wide receivers and running backs, and you're showing some skilled players the guy they might be catching passes from and so forth. That's important too. So one big ad for Indiana, another one that potentially could be a big sort of return from the portal. We'll leave it there for now. We'll be back if anything major happens in the portal, and obviously we'll be back from the Kansas game tomorrow. For now, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.